You wouldn't think that 3 years would be enough for a large leap in performance to occur in the low to mid-range space. But you'd be surprised. This Asus Vivobook 16 right here straight up dominates my old daily driver Aspire 3 by such a margin that doing this upgrade barely 3 years into its service is actually worth it for the sheer increase in performance for almost the same price that this used to go for, not to mention its other benefits. So, let's take a closer look at this thing, shall we? And put into context how upgrading in the mid-range works in this era of fierce competition. Asus's Vivobook line has long been a value brand that caters to people who want a good deal for a solid performing laptop which looks and feels decent enough, but not quite in the level of Asus's more premium ZenBook line. The Vivobook 14, 15, and 16 then is smack dab in the middle of the Vivobook line, slotting in above the unlabeled laptops and just below the X, Pro, and OLED variants of this lineup. This means that this is sort of an entry-level mid-range laptop with decent build quality and, more importantly, good performance for students, hobbyists, and professionals who don't want to break the bank. With that in mind, I have with me the Indie Black version of the Vivobook 16, and can I just say how great this thing looks and feels for a mid-range device? The understated matte black chassis here feels solid despite being made of plastic, with a surprising amount of rigidity for such a large device, and an overall clean look that just screams professional looking. I can pull this out in almost any setting and no one would bat an eye despite its large size. To be clear, more expensive laptops have better build quality and the chassis rigidity isn't the best by far. But this kind of build sets a new standard for its class in my opinion, for both looks and feel. One thing I don't like about it is that the antimicrobial coating is one hell of a fingerprint magnet due to the matte black look, which means that you will have to clean this fairly often to avoid looking like an oil-filled mess. It's fine, but I guess you can't always have your cake and eat it too. Speaking of cake, this display is one hell of a treat to my eyes after daily driving a TN panel for 3 years. It's equipped with a 16-inch 1920 by 1200 IPS display with a 16 by 10 aspect ratio that looks great to the eyes and makes productivity that much better. Honestly, I never thought I would have considered daily driving a 16-inch laptop purely because of the size. But now, all I see is how small traditional 14-inch laptop screens look compared to this laptop, especially with that 16 by 10 aspect ratio. And as an IPS display, viewing angles are very much decent, with colors that don't shift dramatically when you look at it at any other angle other than head-on, unlike in TN displays. It's not perfect though. Brightness is good enough for indoor conditions, though outdoor visibility could pose some challenge. And the bigger issue here is about those colors. According to Artings, this display is only capable of displaying 66% of the sRGB color gamut, which makes this actually not good enough for color grading and photo editing, since it can't display a large range of colors. With that said, watching content on this thing is more than acceptable, especially with such a massive size, and contrast is also surprisingly good. The bezels are also great, with what Asus is touting as nano-edge bezels that allows this device to have an impressive 86.5% screen-to-body ratio, reducing its overall footprint and making this device look very modern indeed. What's also impressive are the keyboard and touchpad. I typed this entire script on the laptop and I can comfortably say that this is pretty much the best laptop keyboard that I have ever used. The switches are snappy and tactile, which does require quite a bit of actuation for us to type on, but has a satisfying click and a surprising amount of travel. It did take a while to get used to, thanks to having a different positioning from 14-inch laptops that I've used, as the keyboard and the trackpad are shifted to the left to account for the added numpad. But once I got going, I was able to comfortably maintain my normal typing speed of around 70 to 100 words per minute. Plus, it has adjustable backlighting, which is nice to use in the dark. The trackpad is also great, with its big size that Asus touts as mega-sized. okay, but in fairness, it tracks well, and the large surface area means that I no longer have to go over the edge when I'm scrolling. Yay! There's still room to improve on the size, but as it is, the tracking is solid, multi-touch support is great, and the addition of the fingerprint sensor for Windows Hello is a nice touch. I/O is another strong point for this laptop. On the left is a lone USB 2.0 Type A port, and on the right is where things get interesting. There's a barrel plug for the charger, HDMI 1.4, USB 3.0 Type A 5GB ports, and a single Type-C 5GB port with support for power delivery. This means that while there is an included 45-watt barrel charger with the laptop, I could also buy a Type-C charger which could charge this laptop as well as my phone with a single port, which is convenient. There's nothing really missing here apart from maybe an SD card reader. But given that SD card adapters are fairly cheap these days, it's not that big of a deal. The loss of Ethernet is also not that big of a deal since this laptop is equipped with a MediaTek Wi-Fi card capable of Bluetooth 5.3 and Wi-Fi 6E, a feature that I don't really have much use for right now, but could come in handy once Wi-Fi 6 becomes more mainstream. Though it's worth noting that it is a 1x1 Wi-Fi card, which means that the reception may not be as good as a 2x2 Wi-Fi card, though in my experience it does work fine and gets up to relatively high speeds in our Wi-Fi network. And you'll need that connection for taking those Zoom calls for school and work, right? For that, this laptop comes equipped with a 720p webcam, which is fine. I mean, it's not great, it's grainy and it's kind of dark looking, but it's good enough, and at least it's 720p. It does have a standard webcam light in here, and you can even close the webcam with its shutter if you don't want anyone spying on you. This is combined with a dual mic array that sounds decent enough with or without the AI denoising that Asus provides, so yeah, pretty good overall for communication here. The speakers, meanwhile, are okay. It gets loud enough, though it lacks bass and top end, and is mostly just mids, though it does sound fine for its class. What's definitely not mid, however, are the specs of this laptop. This Asus Vivobook 16 M1605 as configured has an AMD Ryzen 5 7530U CPU with 6 Zen 3 cores and 12 threads, clocked at 2 GHz base and can boost up to 4.5 GHz, with integrated Radeon graphics that has 7 Vega CUs, clocked up to 2 GHz, partnered with 8 GB of soldered DDR4 3200 MHz memory with an empty SODIMM slot and a 500 GB NVMe SSD for storage, all for a cool 31,000 pesos or around $560 US. The first thing I actually did here is to increase that RAM by adding a 4 GB stick, bumping us up to 12 gigs and allowing the system to run in dual channel memory to increase performance. This is a fairly inexpensive upgrade nowadays, and it will net you a large bump in performance, a topic that we'll dive deeper in another time. For now, let's put this thing into context. Adjusting for inflation, this laptop costs about the same as the Aspire back in 2021, including the RAM upgrade. And this is actually among the best specs for the price that you can get without too much bargain hunting or sacrificing other facets of the laptop. There's actually an Intel version for this exact chassis, featuring an i5 1235U, but if Notebook Check is anything to go by, I'd say that going AMD here is probably the better option. So, let's see how it performs. In CPU tests, this laptop completely obliterates my old Aspire 3, landing around 2.5 to 3 times the performance. Even compared to my i5 desktop, this thing outpaces the 65-watt i5 8400, due probably to Zen 3's IPC advancements, support for SMT, and the high clocks provided to those Zen 3 cores by Asus's cooling solution. More on that in a bit. It's actually amazing how much performance has gone up in 3 years, where what once was a solid mid-range laptop is now firmly in the low end. I mean, the Aspire is still usable, but having your renders or compiles be 3 times faster is certainly an upgrade. This makes the Vivobook 16 an extremely viable device for any sort of productivity niche, be it photo or video editing, code compilation, and other office tasks. The CPU can power through just about anything within reason, so long as it has enough memory, which, given that you can upgrade the slot to 8 gigs and give the laptop a total of 16 gigabytes of memory, basically makes this machine an excellent workhorse for students, office professionals, and even freelance creatives. Of course, work is one thing, gaming is another. So I took the liberty to test 5 games in its native 16:10 aspect ratio in multiple settings to see how playable these games were. In this test, esports games like Rocket League and CS2, along with simpler titles like Minecraft, achieved playable frame rates in its native resolution with what I would describe as reasonable settings for an iGPU, while more demanding games like City Skylines and Shadow of the Tomb Raider does need to drop resolutions to get playable. With that said, while the Vega 7 is certainly not the highlight of this device, it still performs well enough to cope with some light gaming, and compared to the Vega 8 of the Aspire 3, it was able to pull off modest increases in FPS despite losing one CPU, likely due to the increased clock speed and better optimizations on 7nm. And this carries over to GPU productivity results as well. By the way, if you want a deeper dive of these results and more tests, stay tuned because we will be discussing that in more detail very soon, so get subscribed. For now, let's answer one burning question. How the hell does Asus manage to cool and power this thing? One of my criticisms of the Aspire 3 was the poor cooling solution, which resulted in inconsistent performance. And I'm happy to say that Asus did not screw this one up. Better than that actually, because this CPU, despite having a TDP of just 15 watts, runs between 34 to 38 watts in all core loads. And this is possible thanks to the ample cooling that Asus provided and the power tuning that went into the processor. That combination allows the 7530U to run all 6 cores at 3.4 to 3.6 GHz all day, with temperatures leveling out at a toasty but within spec 85 to 90 degrees depending on ambient, which in this day and age is a prerequisite to hit the maximum performance on any given silicon in a mobile device. And as you can see in our Cinebench throttling test, that performance stays roughly consistent after 20 runs, with minor drops after the CPU stops boosting from 37 to 34 watts. That's hardly something to complain about though, because that's still 20 watts above the base TDP. The fan is fairly audible, though it only really ramps if you're doing something heavy or if you configure the fan curve to performance through the My Asus app. Of course, that's for CPU-only workloads, and in gaming, the temps are well under control at 75 to 85 degrees, with fans that are clearly audible, though not the worst I've ever heard. And that's with the iGPU boosting to around 1500 to 2000 MHz, and the CPU around 2 to 3 GHz, sometimes spiking to 4 GHz. This makes skin temperatures, especially under the WASD keys, very manageable, though I wouldn't recommend resting your hand on the exhaust vents of the laptop since they do get pretty toasty. The overall layout of the cooling is actually pretty good, with dual vents which have both small radiators that intake air and exhaust heat, providing the around 40 watts of cooling that this laptop can handle. All I can say here is good job on the cooling, Asus, and well done AMD for such a well-behaved APU, because with power optimizations also come power savings. In non-heavy office loads, this thing can easily last 7 to 9 hours of battery life even while using the internet. Maybe 10 if you treat it really nicely, which is impressive for a 42 watt-hour battery and a 6-core CPU. Even in gaming, it's not bad, with around 1.5 to 2 hours of gameplay possible, with 2.5 to 3 for non-intensive games, which is actually a really good place to end this review. It's impressive. Look, I remember saying that the Aspire 3 will be my daily driver for many years to come, and that's sort of true. I have used and abused the Aspire for 3 years of constant video editing, rough handling, spontaneous gaming, and other shenanigans, and it still works good enough for what I need to do as a power user. Hell, even i3s are still okay to use today if all you're using it for is office tasks. We've honestly come so far to the point where most users just don't need the leaps and bounds of performance that we've seen thus far. And realistically, a laptop from 5 years ago or more could easily get you by today. But that doesn't mean that progress should be slow either, especially for the professionals and enthusiasts who need more performance for their work or just for progress for the sake of progress. And while I'm partly annoyed that my beloved Aspire 3 and 3500U is getting crushed by its newer siblings just 3 years on, I'm also glad that we're seeing this kind of performance trickle down to the mainstream faster than ever before, with prices and build quality that would have been completely unheard of years ago. This is the kind of competition that consumers need, because it allows us to have access to faster and faster devices at lower and lower prices. With that context in mind, this Asus Vivobook 16 is an excellent mainstream laptop with decent build quality, good screen, great performance for a price tag that's certainly high for many people, but is not outlandish by any means given its performance. Artings actually reviewed this device and featured it in many different articles as their budget pick for 2023. So I guess I don't really need to say anymore. This laptop gets a big thumbs up for its mix of quality of life improvements, performance, and cost. So, and I don't actually say this often because I usually don't do recommendations, but if you need a laptop for back to school, definitely consider this if you can find it. The links are down below. I'm not sponsored by Asus, by the way, so yeah. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the APU video. It's coming, I swear. There's also a link probably down below after that for the entire test suite that I've done on this laptop, as well as the Aspire 3. So you can go review that for the methodology.